But Robert Greene spent 6 years, 6 actual years, reading history, studying psychology, going through the work of Freud and Jung and Adler and evolutionary biologists and military strategists. And what he found is this: the reason you think you did something and the reason you actually did it are almost never the same thing. And the gap between those two things, that gap right there, is where your entire life is actually being decided. Now, most summaries of this book will give you a list: 18 laws, 18 definitions, 18 historical figures, and you'll finish feeling like you learned something. And then 3 days later, you'll find yourself in the exact same pattern you've always been in. Because knowing about human nature and actually seeing it operating inside you, those are two completely different things. So that's what we're doing today. We're not doing the list, we're going underneath it. And I want you to do something before we start. Think of one person, someone in your life who you've always found hard to read, someone whose behavior consistently surprises you, or frustrates you, or just doesn't quite make sense. Hold that person in your mind while we go through this, because by the end, I want you to consider the possibility that the person you're thinking of isn't the mystery, you are. Because we spend vast amounts of mental energy trying to decode the people around us, we obsess over their motives, their little slights, their quirks, but we're almost entirely unaware that the very lens we're using to look at them is severely distorted by our own internal wiring. And that distortion is exactly what we're going to confront today. Going deep into Robert Greene's The Laws of Human Nature, this is a beast of a book, nearly 600 pages, a dense, layered exploration of who we actually are, pulling from ancient philosophy, modern neuroscience, history, and behavioral science. But the goal here isn't to memorize a framework. We're going to use this material as a mirror. We're going to look at ourselves. Because if you use this as a field guide to diagnose your difficult coworker or your complicated family member, you're missing the point entirely. And that's the trap almost everyone falls into with psychological material. It's easy to do. We love using concepts like narcissism or repression to explain other people's behavior. It gives us a sense of clarity, even superiority. But the reality is, this entire body of work is designed as a diagnostic manual for your own mind. So let's start there, because to truly look in that mirror, we have to start with Greene's central thesis. And honestly, it's a significant blow to the human ego. The core idea is this: we are emotional animals who occasionally manage to be rational. Not rational animals who occasionally get emotional. That flips the entire script we tell ourselves. Because that internal narrative we spin about why we made a certain decision, why we said what we said, why we reacted the way we did, it's almost always a story we construct after the fact, to justify something we'd already decided to do, for reasons we don't fully have access to. And to understand the mechanics of why that happens, you have to strip away the modern world and look backward, way backward, into evolutionary biology. Our early ancestors spent over 5 million years relying almost entirely on emotional communication, because language wasn't a thing yet. Things like joy, shame, gratitude, and fear weren't just internal feelings, they were literal survival mechanisms. Long before complex spoken language existed, early humans needed to coordinate with their group in order to survive extraordinarily hostile environments. If one person at the edge of the camp spotted a predator and felt pure terror, they didn't have time to articulate a warning. That visceral emotion of fear had to spread instantly. Emotions were essentially the original human communication network. We evolved to be incredibly permeable to the moods of others. We had to be. It was literally a matter of life and death. And those ancient neurological systems, they still dominate the baseline operating system of our brains today. We love to believe that because we carry smartphones and sit in offices, we've outgrown that primal programming, but our neurology is still fundamentally wired for the savannah. And that's the exact reason we're so susceptible to emotional contagion online. Why outrage spreads so fast. Why we instinctively form in-groups and out-groups. Our brains are constantly seeking that tribal emotional synchronization. So if our brains are genuinely wired like that, assuming the people around us are acting out of pure logic is a recipe for constant disappointment. Greene illustrates this brilliantly through Pericles and the Athenians during the Peloponnesian War. Pericles was a stoic, calculating leader. His entire strategy against the Spartans was built on cold, hard logic. He convinced the Athenians to stay behind their city walls and use their superior navy to supply the city, which strategically made complete sense. It completely avoided a ground war with Spartan infantry, which would have been catastrophic. On paper, it was a flawless plan, a masterclass in strategic restraint. But then a plague broke out inside those crowded city walls. It decimated the population, and Pericles himself contracted it and died. What happened next is a perfect psychological case study in how quickly logic collapses under emotional pressure. The Athenians weren't just grieving, they were terrified. They felt powerless, and they were overwhelmingly angry. The physical disease created a psychological one, and in that heightened emotional state, they completely abandoned Pericles' framework. They launched a series of impulsive, emotionally driven military campaigns that ultimately cost them the war and their empire. Now, I know what you might be thinking. If we're so fundamentally emotional, why does it feel like I'm being logical? When I sit down to make a major decision, buying a car, changing jobs, it feels genuinely thought through. I'm looking at the numbers, I'm comparing options, and that right there is the fundamental illusion of consciousness. Our brains have an almost miraculous capacity for narrative generation. Think of it this way. The emotional center of the brain acts like a CEO. It makes a split-second gut decision based on fear, ego, or the need for status. And then milliseconds later, the rational part of the brain acts like a PR department. It drafts a beautiful, logical explanation for why that decision was actually deeply strategic. So the emotional CEO decides, I want that expensive car because it signals status, but you can't admit that. So the PR department says, actually, we're buying this car because the safety ratings are excellent, and you genuinely believe it. And if you look closely at cognitive biases, they are literally just the PR department's specific strategies. Confirmation bias is the PR department making sure you only absorb information that supports the emotional decision already made. In-group bias is rationalizing why your tribe is more virtuous. So true rationality isn't our default setting. We aren't born rational. It's an unnatural state. Rationality is a muscle. And just like any muscle, it will weaken if you don't deliberately work it. So how do you actually build it? You start by identifying your specific emotional triggers. What makes your stomach drop? What makes you instantly defensive in a conversation? You have to notice when that ancient emotional response starts firing. The goal isn't to stop feeling, because that's impossible, but you can extend the gap between feeling the emotion and reacting to it. You train yourself to observe. So if our baseline is constant emotional turbulence, and our rational mind is mostly working over time, the next thing we have to examine is how we protect that fragile sense of self. Which brings us to one of the most uncomfortable parts of this book, the reality of narcissism. Now, narcissist has become a cultural buzzword. We use it to describe anyone who acts selfishly, but Greene argues something far more foundational here. Narcissism isn't a rare personality disorder reserved for a handful of difficult people. It's a spectrum, and every single one of us is on it. We all carry a baseline level of self-absorption. On the extreme pathological end, Greene looks at figures like Joseph Stalin, and perhaps surprisingly, the brilliant author Leo Tolstoy. And what becomes clear is that extreme narcissism almost never comes from genuine self-love. That's the mask. Underneath it, there's a profound and agonizing internal void. Deep down, the narcissist feels chaotic and empty. So the mechanism they develop to survive is to aggressively control everything around them, seeking constant validation from others to temporarily soothe that inner chaos. In Stalin, that manifested as murderous paranoia. In Tolstoy, it manifested as domestic tyranny. His family's entire existence had to revolve around his emotional volatility. But then there's the other end of the spectrum, what Greene calls healthy narcissism. And look at Sir Ernest Shackleton, the legendary polar explorer. You don't attempt to cross the Antarctic continent on foot unless you have an enormous sense of your own capability. You have to believe you are capable of something historically exceptional. Shackleton is the perfect counterpoint to the pathological narcissist because he possessed immense self-regard and ambition. But the key difference lies in what happened when his environment completely collapsed. When his ship, the Endurance, was crushed by Antarctic ice, leaving him and his crew stranded in arguably the most hostile, unlivable environment on the planet, his narcissism didn't turn inward into panic or tyranny, it expanded outward. Because his ego was so deeply tied to his identity as a great leader, he mapped his entire sense of self-worth onto the survival of his men. A pathological narcissist in that same situation would have either sacrificed the crew to save themselves or completely broken down because their grand vision was destroyed and their ego couldn't handle it. But Shackleton did the opposite. He used his immense self-belief as an engine to fuel his empathy. He observed his crew with meticulous, almost clinical precision. He knew exactly who was prone to despair, who needed a stern word, and who just needed a laugh. He managed their interpersonal conflicts, their fears, and even their caloric intake with extraordinary emotional intelligence. That is the transformation Greene is pointing to, taking that raw innate self-absorption and consciously directing it outward, turning the spotlight off yourself and onto the people around you, using your own drive to elevate them. Now, speaking of things we absolutely resist admitting about ourselves, let's talk about envy. Nobody ever admits they are envious. It is one of the ugliest, most deeply taboo emotions we carry. People will admit to anger, they'll admit to feeling low, even greedy, but envious? Never. And there's a very specific psychological reason for that. To admit you're experiencing envy is to simultaneously admit to your own sense of inferiority. It is a conscious acknowledgement that someone else possesses something, whether that's status, talent, wealth, or beauty, that you deeply desire but feel you fundamentally lack. That realization is incredibly painful to the ego. So the PR department buries it. It says, no, we are not jealous. They just got lucky. They don't actually deserve it. But emotions don't vanish just because we repress them. The pressure builds, and it eventually leaks out in the most insidious ways. It shows up as passive-aggressive comments, as inexplicable shifts in mood when someone else is being praised, or as the perfectly delivered backhanded compliment. The backhanded compliment is the hallmark of envy. Think about a moment when you achieved something genuinely significant. Maybe you got a promotion, or hit a personal goal, or bought your first home. Think about the moment you shared that news, and try to remember if someone close to you, a friend, a sibling, a colleague, gave you a compliment that somehow, inexplicably, made you feel smaller. Something like, wow, you got that director role. They must really be restructuring the department, disguised as a casual observation. But that right there is the leak. That is the internal pressure valve of their envy, releasing just a small hiss of poison into the room. A powerful historical example of this dynamic is Jane Williams, who presented herself as the devoted, caring best friend of Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein. To the outside world, Jane was the picture of loyalty. But internally, she harbored a deep, agonizing envy of Mary's intellect, her growing literary reputation, and especially her passionate relationship with Percy Shelley. She couldn't attack Mary directly, because that would expose the envy and destroy her social standing. So the mechanism she used was a quiet, relentless campaign of subtle sabotage. She would plant tiny seeds of doubt in Percy's mind about Mary's affection. She would subtly undermine Mary's confidence in social situations. Envy almost always hides behind the mask of deep friendship or genuine concern. That is what makes it so difficult to detect. And if human nature means that everyone is quietly nursing a fragile ego, and everyone is susceptible to envy, then the worst thing you can possibly do when you succeed is to act invincible. Greene's advice here is pragmatic. If you achieve something significant, practice calculated self-deprecation. Do not flaunt your success. Attribute a meaningful portion of it to luck, to timing, or to the people around you. Share the credit. By doing that, you give the fragile egos around you an out. You prevent their internal comparison engine from triggering that painful feeling of inferiority. You're essentially throwing a blanket over the tripwire so it doesn't detonate. Now, if we are constantly hiding our envy and suppressing our primal emotions just to function in society, where does all that suppressed energy actually go? Because it doesn't just disappear. And this leads us straight into Carl Jung's concept of the shadow. From the time we're toddlers, society teaches us to push down our aggression, our selfishness, our stranger impulses, and keep the lid on tight so we can be functional at school, at work, in relationships. But those primal drives don't evaporate just because we ignore them. They get pushed down into what Jung called the shadow. And if you don't find a healthy way to release that pressure, eventually something gives. The more tightly you repress those unacceptable parts of yourself, the more volatile and desperate that shadow energy becomes. It starts operating on its own, underneath your awareness, shaping decisions and reactions you don't fully understand. Richard Nixon is a textbook example of how the shadow operates when it's pushed down too far. He spent decades meticulously building a mask of absolute control, the straight-laced statesman, the champion of law and order. But beneath that heavily armored public image, there was a vast reservoir of repressed psychological material, paranoia, an intense feeling of being an outsider, a ruthless, cutthroat ambition that felt it had to destroy political enemies just to survive. All of it was in the shadow. All of it had been denied and pushed down for years, and it ultimately erupted in the Watergate scandal. The elaborate mask he had constructed for decades shattered under the accumulated weight of everything he had refused to look at. He couldn't stop it. The shadow took the wheel. So this raises the obvious practical question. If we all carry this shadow, this internal reservoir of aggressive, selfish, sometimes destructive energy, and repressing it causes that kind of collapse, what is the alternative? Are we supposed to just remove the lid entirely? Start acting on every dark impulse? Tell people exactly what we think of them, with no filter? That is the most common and dangerous misconception about shadow work. The solution is not to let the shadow run wild. That leads to a different kind of destruction. The solution Greene advocates for is integration. You first have to brutally acknowledge that the shadow exists within you. You have to look at it directly, understand its specific triggers, because once you stop denying it, you can actually work with that energy rather than being controlled by it. You take that raw, aggressive, competitive shadow energy and you channel it into something constructive, into your work, into physical training, into creativity. You give it a productive outlet, or you use it defensively. When you encounter genuinely manipulative or destructive people, you tap into your shadow's capacity for boundaries, for firmness, for the part of you that knows how to hold a line. You never let the shadow drive the car, but you absolutely use it as fuel in the engine. Now, that constant effort to hide the shadow connects directly to the literal and figurative masks we wear in every social interaction. If everyone has a shadow they're actively managing, then every social situation is essentially a performance. People wear masks of supreme confidence, excessive kindness, or performative humility. And those masks almost never match the reality of what's operating underneath. The sociologist Erving Goffman wrote extensively on this, exploring a concept he called role distance, the psychological space between who we actually are and the role society expects us to play in any given moment. Think about your customer service voice. Everyone has one. Notice how your posture shifts, how the pitch of your voice changes, how your vocabulary adjusts when you're speaking to an important client or a difficult customer. And notice how fast that shifts the moment the call ends and you turn to the person next to you. Goffman is essentially saying that our entire public life is a complex series of those adjustments, a continuously running performance. And because we are all performing, the words people consciously say are often the least reliable indicators of their true intentions. Greene draws heavily on the work of psychiatrist Milton Erickson here. Erickson was a master at decoding what we can call the second language. While the PR department of the brain is busy constructing the perfect, socially acceptable response, the emotional CEO is constantly leaking the actual truth through nonverbal signals, micro-expressions that flash across the face for a fraction of a second, a sudden rigidity in posture, darting eyes, a momentary flash of tension in the jaw, a slight change in the rhythm of breathing. These are things people cannot fully control. Erickson demonstrated that if you train yourself to pay less attention to what people are consciously saying and more attention to what their nervous system is projecting, you can see right through the performance. It's like turning the volume down on a film and watching only the physical movements of the actors. You often realize that the story their bodies are telling is entirely different from the words in the script. And learning to read that second story, that true story beneath the surface, becomes absolutely critical when we start talking about human character. Greene makes a strong argument that a person's character matters far more than their charm, their credentials, their wealth, or their raw intelligence, because charm is a mask, but character is the bone structure underneath. Character is perhaps the most deeply rooted element of human nature. It is formed by an incredibly complex combination of genetics and early childhood experience. And if you look at the psychological mechanics of attachment theory, pioneered by figures like Melanie Klein and John Bowlby, it explains how our earliest pre-verbal relationships with our caregivers literally wire the neural pathways of our brains. Think about a toddler who falls down and scrapes their knee. The toddler doesn't instantly know how to react. They look up at the parent's face, checking for cues. If the parent panics, the child's nervous system wires itself to associate minor pain with absolute terror. If the parent is calm and soothing, the child learns the mechanism of self-soothing. Attachment theory essentially says that the exact same neurological pathway built when you were 2 years old is the exact pathway that activates 30 years later when your boss doesn't reply to an urgent message. Those early experiences form a blueprint for our character that we compulsively repeat throughout our entire adult lives, and we don't even know we're doing it. The operative word there is compulsive. We repeat these patterns even when they are actively working against us, because the brain prefers the safety of a familiar pattern over the anxiety of the unknown. Look at the life of Howard Hughes. On paper, the man had everything. He was a genuine genius with immense charm, world-changing visions, and virtually limitless wealth, but his underlying character was fatally flawed. Beneath his grand ambitions of dominating aviation and film, he was driven by a deep, uncontrollable need for total, suffocating control, a trait directly rooted in his enmeshed relationship with his mother. He would launch these massive, world-altering ventures, but his compulsive micromanagement and profound inability to trust anyone inevitably led to disaster. He couldn't help himself. He was compelled by his own character to sabotage his grandest designs. We all know a modern version of this pattern. The founder who works relentless hours, talks an extraordinary visionary game, secures significant funding, but absolutely refuses to delegate a single decision. They micromanage everything until the talent walks out and the company collapses. The genius and the vision, that's the mask. The controlling paranoia underneath, that's the character. And the character always wins in the end. So practically speaking, how do we protect ourselves? If people are so capable of hiding deep, compulsive character flaws behind masks of charm and intelligence, how do we avoid getting pulled down with them? You have to completely stop listening to what people promise and start meticulously analyzing what they actually do. The only reliable way to gauge someone's underlying character is observation over time, specifically under stress. How do they behave when things go wrong? How do they treat someone who can do absolutely nothing for them? A waiter, a subordinate, a stranger? Character cannot be hidden forever. It always reveals itself when the pressure gets high enough. The mask slips every single time. Now, let's shift slightly from how we read others to how we consciously project ourselves into the world, because this brings up one of the most fascinating psychological mechanisms in the book, the mechanics of human desire. Think about Coco Chanel. She didn't just design clothes, she completely revolutionized global culture, starting from nothing, from poverty and obscurity. And she achieved that level of cultural dominance because she understood the fundamental mechanics of human desire on a deep, almost instinctive level. She recognized a basic psychological truth. Human beings naturally covet what they do not have, what seems scarce, what appears slightly out of reach. If something is fully explained, too available, or too eager to please, the human brain loses interest almost immediately. There is no vacuum left for the imagination to fill. Chanel weaponized mystery. She withheld information deliberately, knowing people would rush in to fill that vacuum with their own desire and projection. She used calculated aloofness and a revolutionary approach to gender expression, incorporating stark elements of menswear into women's fashion in a way that was entirely unprecedented. She created a persona that people simply could not categorize, and because high society couldn't figure her out, they became obsessed with her. They coveted her style. They craved her attitude. They desperately wanted her approval. By remaining elusive, she forced the world to chase her. The underlying philosophy there connects to some heavy intellectual hitters. Machiavelli, Sun Tzu, and Aristotle's concept of pathos, the art of persuading not through logic, but through raw emotional appeal. The emotional CEO, again, now, a very common reaction to all of this is a serious and legitimate question. Isn't this just a manual for manipulation? If we are learning how to weaponize mystery, how to play on irrational emotions, how is this any different from simply learning to be a highly effective manipulator? It is the most common criticism leveled at Greene's entire body of work, and it deserves a direct answer. The defense for this approach is grounded in a philosophy of stark, unflinching realism. The perspective is that power dynamics and human nature are fundamentally amoral. They are neither inherently good nor inherently evil. They are neutral facts of reality, much like the laws of physics or the mechanics of human physiology. Think about a surgeon. A surgeon must deeply and intimately study pathology. They study disease, necrosis, infection, and physical trauma in precise detail, not because they want to cause harm, but because they need to understand exactly what they are fighting in order to restore health. In the exact same way, we have to study the dark, manipulative, and irrational sides of human nature in order to understand and defend against them. You cannot protect yourself from a skilled manipulator if you refuse to understand how manipulation actually works. Greene isn't inventing these behaviors. He is lifting the veil on psychological patterns that people are already running on you, often entirely unconsciously, every single day. In the book, he is handing you the code so you can finally stop being played by people who simply understand the game better than you do. And that realization leads us into the final phase of what this book is really about. Because once you can clearly see the mechanisms of human nature, once you can see the strings attached to the puppets, the final step is not to go out and exploit everyone around you. The final and most difficult step is to elevate yourself. But before we get there, it's worth addressing the academic criticism of Greene directly. Because he does take significant heat from the scholarly community, critics frequently point out that he is essentially a pop historian who takes complex, messy historical realities and smooths off the jagged edges so the narratives fit cleanly into his defined laws. They argue his sourcing is often driven by the need for a compelling story rather than strict empirical evidence, and if we look at those criticisms honestly, they are not entirely wrong. Greene is not a clinical psychologist conducting peer-reviewed research. He is a synthesizer, a storyteller working with a very specific underlying philosophy. But here is why the work still matters. Because in the book, Greene represents a significant philosophical evolution from his earlier, far more controversial work like the 48 Laws of Power. Where those earlier books were often focused on ruthless conquest and self-preservation at almost any cost, this material pivots sharply towards something closer to Stoicism. The core of this book is fundamentally about developing emotional intelligence, cultivating genuine empathy, and achieving internal self-mastery. The historical examples he uses, even if slightly stylized, function as powerful psychological archetypes. They give us memorable shorthand to recognize invisible patterns playing out in our own daily lives. It's less about historical precision and much more about psychological resonance, which brings us to one of the most powerful examples in the entire book, the life of Anton Chekhov, and what it reveals about the psychology of self-transformation. Chekhov's origin story is almost unimaginably brutal. He was born the son of a former serf. His father was a violently abusive, tyrannical man, and the family lived in crushing, suffocating poverty. By every known metric of psychology and sociology, the severity of that environment should have created an inescapable cycle of bitterness, addiction, and failure. The mechanism of trauma usually dictates that the abused becomes the abuser, or they self-destruct entirely. And yet Chekhov managed to completely break that generational cycle, and the way he did it is extraordinary. He didn't initially change his physical circumstances because he couldn't. He was trapped. What he did instead was radically and deliberately alter his internal cognitive lens. He possessed remarkably keen observational skills, the exact skills that would later make him one of the greatest writers in history and a practicing physician. He took those skills and turned them directly onto his abuser. Instead of seeing his father through the natural lens of hatred, fear, and victimization, Chekhov forced himself to observe his father with a detached, almost clinical understanding. He began analyzing his father's own trauma, his father's limitations, the sheer smallness of his father's rage. He zoomed the camera out so far that the monster simply looked like a broken, miserable man. Greene calls this developing an expansive attitude, and it is one of the hardest things a human being can do. The natural, instinctive response to mistreatment is to become defensive, constricted, and deeply resentful. Chekhov actively cultivated a profound, almost terrifying empathy instead. Because he understood something critical, he had zero control over his father's behavior or their poverty, but his internal attitude, the way he interpreted and processed the circumstances of his life, that was the one thing he had complete sovereign control over. By transforming his perspective, he didn't just survive the trauma, he metabolized it. He eventually lifted his entire family out of poverty. He became one of the most celebrated writers in the Russian language, and he used his hard-won understanding of human frailty to create art that resonated with truths that are still alive today. He proved that while we cannot control the hand we are dealt by genetics or circumstance, our internal attitude entirely determines how that hand is played. Now, that concept of expanding our internal limits, of refusing to be defined by our immediate environment, connects directly to another powerful barrier Greene examines: the rigid roles society assigns us, and specifically how those roles cut us off from half of our own potential. From early childhood, we are conditioned to adopt specific traits based on our gender. Men are taught to suppress vulnerability and deep empathy. Women are often taught to suppress over-ambition and assertiveness. And Greene argues that this suppression effectively amputates half of our potential human toolkit. We are operating at a permanent disadvantage, not because of our actual capabilities, but because of the narrow role we were handed before we were old enough to question it. The historical figure who most powerfully dismantles this limitation is Caterina Sforza, an Italian noblewoman during the Renaissance. She existed in a deeply entrenched patriarchal society that demanded total submission from women, but she refused entirely to be confined by that rigidity. She fully embraced her femininity, her charm, her elegance, her role as a mother, and simultaneously, she integrated qualities that her society coded as exclusively masculine: strategic ruthlessness, military command, political calculation. She didn't choose one side of the divide. She was a fiercely aggressive warrior who literally commanded troops in armor, a brilliant military strategist, and a ruthless politician who terrified her male rivals. By consciously integrating both the masculine and feminine psychological energies within herself, she achieved a level of power, psychological wholeness, and sheer unpredictability that completely baffled and outmaneuvered the rigid, one-dimensional men trying to control her. She realized that everyone else was playing the game with half a deck of cards, and she decided to use the whole deck. That's what this is really about: full access to your own humanity, rather than locking half of it away because society told you it doesn't belong to you. Which brings us, finally, to the deepest basement of human psychology, the one fear that sits underneath all the others, the ultimate boundary we all face, and the one we spend our entire lives running from: our own mortality. This final concept is deeply influenced by Ernest Becker's Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Denial of Death. The core psychological premise is this: almost the entirety of modern human culture is at its root a massive and elaborate unconscious distraction mechanism designed to prevent us from confronting the terrifying reality that we are going to die. We have meticulously engineered our society to push death completely out of sight. We hide it in sterile hospitals behind closed doors. We remove it from daily conversation. We treat it as something that happens to other people, somewhere else, at some later time. But Becker's thesis, which Greene adopts fully, is that this enormous act of societal denial doesn't actually reduce our anxiety. It is the hidden source of it. Because underneath all the distraction, the body knows, the psyche knows, and it is running from something it can never actually outpace. And because we are unconsciously running from the absolute terror of our own non-existence, we desperately fill that space with substitutes. We obsess over petty workplace dramas. We exhaust ourselves chasing status on social media. We grind relentlessly to accumulate wealth or build a legacy. Psychologically, these are all subconscious attempts to construct what Becker calls a symbolic immortality project. We operate as though, if we become successful enough, or famous enough, or righteous enough, death will somehow not fully apply to us. But the antidote to that exhausting anxiety is not more distraction. Greene introduces an ancient Stoic practice here to counter it, the practice of memento mori, a Latin phrase meaning, remember that you must die. The practice is deceptively simple. You intentionally and regularly force your conscious mind to confront the undeniable fact of your own finite existence. To a modern mind, that sounds morbid. It sounds depressing, even nihilistic. Why would anyone want to think about dying on a regular basis? But the psychological mechanism of memento mori is actually the exact opposite of depressing. It is profoundly liberating. Here is how it works. When you genuinely and deeply internalize the fact that your time on this earth is strictly limited and that it could end far sooner than you expect, something shifts. The trivial, exhausting dramas of daily life instantly lose their grip on you. The petty envy of a colleague, the desperate need to be right in an argument, the paralyzing fear of what strangers think of you, all of it is suddenly revealed for what it actually is, a waste of the very limited time you have been given. Meditating on death clarifies what is actually meaningful to you. It creates a deep, visceral appreciation for the simple fact of being alive in the present moment. It liberates you to live with genuine, uncompromising purpose. Because when death is no longer a thought you are frantically running from, it becomes the most honest advisor you have ever had. It strips away every mask. It silences the PR department. And it leaves only what is real. So let's bring all of this together. We have covered an enormous amount of ground today. We looked at the ancient emotional wiring that makes us fundamentally irrational beneath our polished rational surface. We explored the internal void that drives narcissism and the painful gap between healthy self-regard and pathological self-absorption. We examined envy, that most deeply hidden emotion, and the insidious ways it leaks out through people closest to us. We went into the shadow, that reservoir of repressed energy that operates beneath our awareness, shaping decisions we think we're making freely. We looked at the masks we wear in every social interaction, and the second language our bodies speak underneath the performance. We explored how character, formed in our earliest years, compulsively repeats itself throughout an entire lifetime, whether we see it or not. And we ended with the deepest and most clarifying truth of all, that the awareness of death, when we stop running from it, is one of the most powerful tools for actually living. Now, I want to circle all the way back to where we started. I asked you at the beginning to think of one specific person, someone whose behavior frustrates you, surprises you, or simply doesn't make sense to you. And if everything we've covered today has done nothing more than give you a sharper set of labels to apply to that person, if you're sitting there thinking, now I understand exactly what their problem is, then I have to tell you directly, you have missed the entire point of this material, because the ultimate and inescapable revelation of Greene's work, and of all serious psychological inquiry, is that you are being driven by the exact same ancient forces. You carry the same inherent irrationality. You have the same fragile ego, the same unspoken need for validation, the same shadow threatening to leak out at precisely the wrong moment. We all do, every single one of us. Human nature is the ultimate constant. It is older, deeper, and vastly more powerful than any technology, any algorithm, or any modern institution we have ever built to contain it. And if you refuse to come to terms with these forces operating inside your own mind, you are condemning yourself to a life of perpetual confusion. You will keep repeating the same patterns, but if you have the rare courage to study your own nature with brutal, unflinching honesty, it becomes the most powerful framework for self-mastery you will ever encounter. Which leaves us with one final thought. The philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer once made an observation that has stayed with me. He said that when you encounter stupidity, or cruelty, or simply baffling behavior in the world, you should not get angry or offended. You should train yourself to view it the exact same way a mineralogist views a new rock specimen. You don't yell at the rock for being rough or strangely shaped. You observe it. You get curious about it. You see it as a fascinating piece of data. So tomorrow, when the person you thought of at the start of this episode does that thing that frustrates you, try something different. Don't react, just watch. Actively refuse to let the emotional CEO grab the steering wheel. Take a breath. Observe them as a fascinating, entirely predictable piece of human biology, and then, much more importantly, turn that same quality of observation onto yourself, onto your own immediate reaction, onto the story your PR department is already drafting about why you were right and they were wrong. That moment of self-observation, quiet, honest, and without judgment, is where everything Greene wrote about actually begins.